Hello, everyone. I'll just first of all remind people to turn off their microphones. My name is Don Fleming, and I'm the Managing Director, Educational Initiatives and Policy at CASN. I'm happy to welcome all of you to this Lunch and Learn presented by CASN's Research and Scholarship Committee. The presentations in this series, and this is the final one for the series, focus on use of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and big data, implications for nursing research and education. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. CASN's national office is located on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respect to them, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region and in all regions across Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Lunch and Learns are a popular tool in academia to encourage scholarship. Faculty members come together during their lunch hour to share their work and to network. CASN's webinar series, presented by the Research and Scholarship Committee, aims to recreate that collegial feel of the Lunch and Learn and is intended to serve as an inspiration and a networking opportunity. Nursing faculty from across the country present on a scholarship project and discuss their methodologies, successes, or challenges they have encountered in their work. We'll be recording today's session and begin with the presentation, and then conclude with 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A afterwards. Please note that CASN does not distribute the PowerPoint presentations. So in this session, we'll hear from Dr. Fatou Abdoulaye from the University of British Columbia, who will present Trauma-Informed Design, a new approach to developing safer sexual and reproductive digital health interventions. Dr. Abdoulaye, thank you for presenting today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Don, and thanks for the introduction. And good morning to those in the West Coast and good afternoon to the East Coast. Welcome to my presentation on trauma-informed design, which I consider as the new approach to developing safer sexual and reproductive health interventions. As Don rightly indicated, my name is Fatou Abdoulaye. I am an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia School of Nursing and also a co-director of the Digital Health Research with Contraception and Abortion Research Team, which is based in UBC but has networks across the country. I would like to acknowledge that while I am at UBC, I live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Musqueam First Nations. In this presentation, I will start by providing an overview of the trauma, the prevalence of trauma, and the type of trauma that people commonly experience. I will then provide an overview of technology-mediated trauma, and then highlight on how digital health interventions can trigger or perpetuate trauma among underserved or marginalized populations. This will then lead me to the emerging concept of trauma-informed design and how this new concept can be applied in the design, deployment, and use of digital health interventions, particularly sexual and reproductive health-related technologies. Then I will conclude by emphasizing on the need for adopting trauma-informed design in not just sexual health technologies, but all digital health interventions across board. First of all, to understand trauma-informed design, we have to understand the root cause of trauma. What is trauma? We've all been hearing of trauma, but actually there's no universal accepted definition of the concept of trauma. And experts tend to create their own definitions based on their clinical experiences or based on the population they deal with. However, the most commonly referenced definition is usually from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the US, where they describe trauma as a result from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physical or emotional harmful, or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual functioning, either physical, social, or emotional or spiritual well-being. Just for the sake of this presentation and for my program of research, I am specifically focused on emotional and psychological trauma. So for us to know that this presentation does not consider physical trauma, which deals with either people having injuries or broken fractures. This presentation is beyond the scope of physical trauma. Trauma varies from person to person because what could be traumatizing to someone may not be traumatizing to the other. And also we should acknowledge that we understand that trauma is invisible. And some people may not even be aware that they are undergoing trauma, or their symptoms is as a result of a traumatic experience. Based on this, it is really difficult to estimate the true prevalence of trauma. But available evidence suggests that approximately 70% of people across the globe would experience a potentially traumatic event during their lifetime. In Canada, this number was estimated as 63% during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as much as 90% of adults in the United States have been estimated to experience a traumatic event sometimes in their life. What does trauma show? What shows that somebody undergoes a trauma or somebody has a traumatic experience? Mind you, people can witness traumatic experience, people can have traumatic events, but it may not lead to traumatic consequences. So people react differently to traumatic events. Some people may not develop any reaction to a major event, while others might have a major reaction to event that could be considered as minor. So whatever the case may be, the initial reactions to trauma could include symptoms like exhaustion, confusion, sadness, anxiety, agitations, numbness, usually dissociation from people, confusing, physical arouseness, and sometimes impaired relationships. Some of these responses are normal and others are not, in that they tend to affect survivors and are socially acceptable, others are not socially acceptable. So indicators of some more severe responses could include continued distress without periods of relative calm or rest, severe dissociation symptoms, and intense intrusive recollection that continue despite a return of safety. Where do trauma come from? And for many of us in this talk, we probably are a bit aware of the sources of trauma. And the most common source of trauma could include like experiencing or observing a physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, sometimes childhood neglect, having a family member with a mental health or a substance use disorder, experiencing or witnessing violence in the community, or while serving usually in the military, and sometimes poverty, and also systemic discrimination could lead to traumatic consequences. We have physical abuse, for example, intimate partner abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, or community violence. The sources or the causes of trauma are infinite, and so many things could cause trauma depending on the population and depending on how people react to those events. Now, another emerging source of trauma, which is not actually recognized or not actually, which is not actually recognized or beginning to be recognized, is through the use of digital health interventions. Trauma resulting from the use of digital health technologies, which is also known as technology-mediated trauma, is becoming common with the increasing use of digital health interventions. And while technology-mediated trauma started appearing in social media platforms, emerging evidence shows that digital health interventions, especially patient-facing digital health technologies, can also trigger or facilitate technology-mediated trauma, depending on its interface design or how they are deployed or used by patients. This technology-mediated trauma perpetrated through digital health platforms may produce worse outcomes, particularly for vulnerable populations who use these technologies as either a complementary or alternative sources of seeking for information or health services. Just like trauma itself, there is not yet a universal accepted definition of technology-mediated trauma. I would even say that there's no definition for it. But based on the available literature and my work in this space over the past 2 years, I think of technology-mediated trauma generally as technology-enabled activities, interface appearances, or features that leaves a user in emotional distress following the use of a digital health technology. Now, how does digital technologies cause trauma? It's actually hard to think of ways in which technologies could cause trauma or could perpetuate trauma. Just recently, I was having a conversation with a colleague software engineer, and I was discussing this topic. And what he told me was that it's difficult for him to imagine how technologies would actually cause trauma, because for him, all he sets out to do is he set out with a good heart to help people, and he do a lot of testing to make sure that interventions are really appropriate before they are deployed. So it's difficult for him to imagine. And that is true when you think of technologies in the context of mainstream society. But when we talk of technology-mediated trauma, usually we tend to think of re-traumatizing people that are often treated as edge cases. And when I say edge cases, usually vulnerable and marginalized populations. For instance, it is rare that digital technologies could cause trauma to people that have never experienced trauma in the past. So technology-mediated trauma may not be an issue in the mainstream society because they see greater value in technology. Rather, technology-mediated trauma is a major issue among marginalized populations, particularly survivors of trauma, because poor technologies could trigger, perpetuate past experiences of trauma. And this is where the focus is when we talk of technology-mediated trauma. So in actual sense, it is not about technology causing trauma. It is about technology re-traumatizing people and perpetuating trauma or perpetuating the societal practices that tend to cause trauma. So in thinking of technology-mediated trauma, we think of re-traumatization, which can be intentional or unintentional, can be obvious or subtle, and is always harmful in one way or the other. Of course, we should know that trauma has no respect for race, gender, ethnicity, and we also know that everyone can be exposed to trauma. However, when you think of technology-mediated trauma, minority and marginalized populations tend to be disproportionately or are likely to be disproportionately affected. For example, racialized people, migrants, people with disabilities, homeless and underhoused people, sex workers, 2S LGBTQI people, indigenous people are likely to be faced with a disproportionate burden of technology-mediated trauma. And this is because these populations are likely to have prior traumatic experiences. So why might these populations experience high rate of trauma? In modern designs, like in modern technology designs, especially with software engineers, humans generally are often imagined as white, usually cis male, Anglo-Saxon, heterosexual, affluent, and of able body and mind. Usually marginalized and underserved populations are not well represented in the design or in the implementation of new technologies. So of course, designers may neglect what they consider as edge cases or situations that are perceived to occur outside their dominant narratives. So when technologies are designed with the dominant narratives, they would appear as the exclusion of people who are not part of the majority group and a lack of attention to the safety and care of these populations. Now, how does technology-mediated trauma occur in the context of digital health technologies? So one way of re-traumatizing people is by deliberately using technologies to cause trauma. For instance, digital technologies can trigger emotional trauma through interface features that may be used to harass, coerce, or stalk people. These sort of abuses can range from intimate image abuse or intimate partner abuse to the use of geolocating features for stalking, and also through the use of Internet of Things devices to manipulate people into doubting their sanity. Activities like cyberbullying, which can be perpetrated through online social networking site, for example, digital health technologies that has site for connecting with people with lived experiences can be used as forums to harm others through their comments, and other forms of communication on digital platforms, for example, chat rooms, user subscription channels, and also forum or bulletin posts may be used unscrupulously to victimize and expose people in a manner that could result in emotional trauma. On the other hand, a lot of technology-mediated trauma activities may occur unintentionally. And this is usually through interface features that remind people of prior traumatic circumstances. Or this could be through clinicians or healthcare professionals not knowing how to communicate with survivors of trauma through digital health interventions. For survivors of trauma who use sexual and reproductive health technologies, for instance, viewing sexually explicit content that they consider to be inappropriate can re-traumatize them, and this can create technology-facilitated cycles of re-traumatization each time the content is viewed. We also know that people may also experience harm due to only male and female gender options in user interfaces. For instance, it's common to see the exclusion of gender diverse people in online forums and disabled people. And exclusion in this manner could either trigger traumatic experience or could remind people of the societal prejudices that they face that tends to trigger trauma. Now, to further understand technology-mediated trauma in the context of sexual and reproductive health, we applied for a shared insight development grant a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago, to explore technology-mediated trauma among marginalized populations who use sexual and reproductive health services. In this project, we recruited 30 participants through an online research platform in British Columbia known as ReachBC. And these people identified as coming from an underserved population and with a prior experiences of trauma. We conducted a virtual interview with each of these participants that lasted approximately 60 minutes. And the purpose of this study, as I indicated, is to produce an explanatory model of how emotional trauma manifests in the context of sexual and reproductive health technologies. What I observed is that usually this topic is actually less research, and I'll show you in one of the reviews that we are currently conducting. And this study was to serve as the foundation for further research to examine trauma-informed design or explore ways in which trauma-informed design can be applied in digital health. So we are currently analyzing the data from this study, and the preliminary findings fell into three major thematic areas on how digital health technologies can foment trauma for people accessing sexual and reproductive health services. The first concern among participants was how images, videos, and the language used on digital platforms, things I would, under normal circumstances, not see as a problem. People were concerned about how this could remind them of prior traumatic experiences and how such reminders can lead to traumatic symptoms. Even seemingly neutral user interface elements that are developed in line with established design guidelines. For instance, the use of different colors can still trigger emotional trauma in people with negative prior experiences or a negative attitude towards such colors or such elements. One participant indicated, and I quote, I think any kind of video or imagery that could either depict an act of trauma could be problematic potentially. And if somebody were to go to a website to figure out assault, and then they show the fiction of an assault in like a video and seeing this or that, even things like police or first responders who would potentially have shown up as a scene could be traumatizing or triggering. The next concern, which constitutes the second thematic category, was how participants could be re-traumatized by basically having a conversation with a healthcare provider through a virtual means or telemedicine. This issue is particularly concerning because I initially indicated that there's been a high adoption of virtual care in Canada, and there's been a high rate of people that have experienced traumatic events. So people are concerned about providers using certain words or statements that could remind them of prior traumatic experiences, or that does not acknowledge the fact that people may have traumatic experiences. So one participant indicated, and I quote, I just think even in my experiences, like talking with a doctor or a medical professional that doesn't have a very good bedside manner and that doesn't communicate in a very empathetic, in a very kind way, could be very frustrating. When I don't feel empathy when communicating with my provider virtually, it just makes me feel really shut down and I'm not listened to. And this finding was really, really great, and the participants really emphasized about it, because usually in virtual conversation, what we find out was that clinicians maybe probably after the introduction, they tend to go straight to the point and discuss the patient's symptoms or what they are presenting with. But people really indicated that, yes, they may be presenting with a health condition, but they have other issues that transcend beyond that condition or issue, or other issues. For instance, in the case of somebody who sought contraception services and somebody who sought for abortion, for example, the person who sought for abortion services said, there are a lot of circumstances that led to me being pregnant and led to me seeking an abortion. So if a healthcare professional goes straight ahead to talk about how I can access abortion, how the drugs I can take, that is not really acknowledging the situation, because abortion is just a symptom of the overall situation. Getting pregnant was just a symptom of traumatic events that the person experienced that even led to the pregnancy in the first place. Now, another thematic area in which technology could cause trauma was through accidental disclosure of personal information. This might not be strange to a lot of people. And others were concerned about being inundated with sexualized images or targeted advert after using a web-based intervention. But what was surprising was that people are not just concerned about maybe in the event of accidental disclosure of personal information, but to even think of it was concerning and possible a trauma trigger factor, and a reason that people might even abandon using technologies. One person said, "My biggest concern in the world of healthcare is data encryption and security. Like if labs results are being leaked, or they would not resist cyber attacks. To think of the possibility of a data breach is quite concerning to me, and that's the biggest issue with healthcare essentially." So these three thematic areas highlight the way that trauma can be perpetrated or can be triggered through digital health interventions, particularly for marginalized and underserved populations. Now, why is technology-mediated trauma an issue? Why is it a concern at all? After all, we have been using digital health interventions. And I initially didn't think it was an issue, but now I think it is. Because available evidence suggests that digital health interventions are more accessible to advantageous groups, and they are almost always more effective among privileged populations. This means that digital health interventions may not be realizing its full potential among marginalized and underserved populations. And technology-mediated trauma is a concern because people from minority groups might have experienced one form of trauma or the other, which the mainstream society may not probably experience. Therefore, any potential unintended consequences of digital health technologies may limit their use and further create or increase health inequities among those with the greatest need. Now, because this is a concern, there is the concept of trauma-informed design. The concept of trauma-informed design started appearing as blog posts somewhere in the 2090s, later part of 2020s. But before that, it was widely adopted in architecture and in the built environment. People were looking at ways to make sure that buildings and infrastructure are actually trauma-informed. But in the context of technologies, this concept started appearing just recently in the 2020, and is usually led by what I would say even software engineers and little by healthcare professionals. Now, we cannot talk about trauma-informed design without discussing trauma-informed care. So just like trauma, there is no universal accepted definition for trauma-informed care. And as usual, people tend to rely on the definition from the Substance Use and Mental Health Administration. According to this body, a program, organization, or a system is said to be trauma-informed if it realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, family, staff, and others involved in the system, and respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, practices, and seeks to actively prevent re-traumatization. There are various principles of trauma-informed care, and depending on the literature or the sources you are reading, you could have about 5, 6, or even 7. But I usually tend to use the Fallot and Harris 5 principles of trauma-informed care, which include safety, collaboration, empowerment, and trustworthiness. And in the context of digital health technologies, usually the traditional definition of safety is about safety in physical spaces, but in the context of digital health technologies, safety is usually conceptualized as more of emotional safety rather than physical safety. trauma-informed design, or what others call trauma-informed computing, has been adapted from the trauma-informed care framework, and it represents an ongoing commitment to designing and deploying safer digital health technologies by acknowledging trauma, acknowledging its impact, and recognizing that digital technologies can both cause and exacerbate trauma, and actively seeking out ways to avoid technology-related experiences of trauma. By adopting trauma-informed framework, we will be able to understand approaches on how to create and deploy safe digital platforms that limits the potential for further harm to end users who seek care in a highly stigmatized spaces like sexual and reproductive health. In order to understand the extent in which trauma-informed design is being adopted in digital health, we decided to conduct a scoping review to ascertain the current state of the literature that has adopted trauma-informed care in digital health, or that have provided recommendations for trauma-informed design of digital health technologies. We decided to publish the protocol last year, and we are now undergoing data screening and extraction for the studies currently. We have only 952 hits, and then 44 duplicates were removed, leaving us with 548 for review. And while we are yet to review this literature, the limited number of hits tells you that this is a less researched topic. And we see that trauma-informed practices is not widely adopted in the design and deployment of digital health interventions. What we also saw was that many of the recommendations or the trauma-informed design principles that we see in the literature were mainly coming from software engineers and computer scientists who may not have a comprehensive understanding of trauma or trauma-informed care in the healthcare context. So you see that most of the recommendations in the literature are rather trauma-specific rather than trauma-informed approaches. And I'll distinguish between these two. For example, a trauma-specific approach could be asking survivors of trauma about how to heal from or prevent a trauma. And if you are producing a recommendation for a survivor of trauma that we are constantly asking about their trauma experiences or how they will heal from it, that is a trauma-specific approach and not a trauma-informed approach. And that approach has the likelihood of re-traumatizing people. A trauma-informed approach is more of a healing and a cooperative approach that does not create the opportunity for reminding people about their experiences. And usually, a proper trauma-informed approach would go on without even the word trauma, or without even mentioning the word trauma or trauma-informed. So this is our preliminary findings that we got from this study. We are hoping to write up the manuscript somewhere, probably before the end of this year. This preliminary findings were recently presented by one of my graduate students at the CNI conference, which was held last week. And to explore ways in which digital technologies could be developed with trauma-informed, one of my graduate students, as part of the shared project, is conducting interviews with survivors of trauma to understand ways in which sexual and reproductive health technologies could be developed with trauma-informed. She's currently conducting interviews based on the sample that we are using for the foundational study, and she analyzed the data from 6 transcripts and wrote an abstract that was accepted for presentation at the Nursing Informatics International Congress, which is taking place in Manchester in July this year. There were quite interesting findings from the participants, and this might not be strange to a lot of you. And just as indicated before, people were concerned about the colors, images in the videos that may arouse negative emotions, and the fact that, careful attention needs to be paid in making sure that such content are not actually displayed on digital platforms. And the best way to do this is to conduct user testing on content. Usually, user testing is usually conducted to assess functionality, whether people can the ease of use, ease of functionality. But people were more interested in having to test whatever content that's been displayed on a digital platform. They also talked about paying careful attention to privacy and confidentiality and maximizing the principles of inclusive design. Basically, representative images that aligns with the overall tone of the resource content and capturing the rich diversity of ages, ethnicities, and gender. We interviewed one person who is an immigrant, a Black person who was like, she actually visited a contraception website to look for information, and they made it the issue of pro-choice. When they say pro-choice, it means people having the liberty to choose whatever they want to choose. And for her, choosing contraception was not just a liberty. The situation demands. It's not just something that she wanted. And she felt like she is not being represented in this platform. And whatever is being portrayed, put up, does not represent her. So one approach is also to adopt an intersectionality approach, which was one of the greatest findings, in actually developing technologies by first of all acknowledging these diverse populations, diverse minority groups, in coming out with the technology. Because mind you, whatever works for the edge cases, the minority populations would definitely work for the mainstream society. But it's always difficult to say that what works for the mainstream society will work for minority groups. So if we develop technology interventions by first focusing on minority populations, trying to address their concerns, trust me, it will work for the overall population. And aside from designing platforms, they also talked about approaches for engaging with survivors of trauma. And as previously mentioned, usually a clinician, a healthcare professional, may not fully understand the background of people that they communicate virtually with. What clinicians need to do is that assume that people who reach out to you are potential survivors of trauma. And from this interviewing these participants, I could tell that these people have undergone prior traumatic issues. And the reason I say is that just from my observations of these participants, I usually conduct virtual interviews and we talk on Zoom, people on their videos, people just talk to you freely. But in this research, almost nobody wants to show you their face. And we have options for delivering honoraria, and people don't want to be sent anything by post. Like, they are really, really scared about revealing their identity. And their responses to the questions shows that all is not actually well with them. So if they present an issue to a clinician, the focus should not just be the issue, but what probably causes. So clinicians will come with an assumption that people that reach out to them through digital means, either through telemedicine or virtual care, might have undergone a prior traumatic issue and maybe adopt certain approaches. They mentioned approaches like debriefing, validating patient's concern, and then active listening. Set the stage for the person to ventilate their concerns. Don't go ahead and ask about, oh, what is wrong with you? How can I help you? What condition, how is your condition? Just set the space. Just one person said something like, I would want when I initiate a conversation with a healthcare provider on phone or even on Skype, they don't see me. They don't know what I've gone through. So first of all, they should tell me, just let me ventilate my feelings. And even if I tell them about my issue, they should ask me things beyond the clinical experiences that I contacted them. There's also clinicians who also set clear expectations for patients and allow patients to set their space. So these were the approaches that some of the points that we got from these interviews. Now, in this program of research, we also got another $15,000 from Michael Smith Health Research BC, because in the whole concept of sexual health was quite broad. So what we wanted to do is that we wanted to convene a stakeholder engagement summit to understand and explore the research priorities of how trauma-informed care can be applied in digital health. When I say the research priorities, which areas of sexual health, which topics of sexual health should we apply this to? And for which population? When diverse, marginalized populations are so much, we have so many diversities in Canada, which population should we focus? So we got this grant from Michael Smith Health Research BC, and then we convened 20 participants that are made up of researchers, patient partners with lived experience of sexual health related issues. We have system developers, software engineers, and clinicians. We first provided them with reading materials to address themselves with the topic of trauma-informed care. And then we held an in-person discussion which was held on 31st May at Vancouver General Hospital. In this stakeholder meeting, what we did was that we informed the participants about the various stages of digital health development and design. Basically, the digital health development life cycle. And these stages include needs assessment, problem and recovery stage, design and development stage, evaluation stage, and then deployment and use stage. We have these 4 areas, and then we ask the participants what principles or aspects of trauma-informed care can be incorporated into each of these stages. What factors should be considered to make sure that each stage of the digital health development life cycle is trauma-informed? And we also went ahead and asked them about the priority research areas or topics that should be considered to make sexual health-related technologies trauma-informed. And at the end of the day, we asked them to identify at least 1 or 2 research questions on how sexual and reproductive health technologies could incorporate trauma-informed care in each of those 4 stages. This was really exciting engagement summit. And what really made it exciting was the interdisciplinary nature of this meeting, because having clinicians, having researchers, having software engineers and patients with lived experiences was really enriching, because it gives this perspective about how people's decisions could contribute to trauma and how to prevent it. For example, software engineers in this summit were really amazed about how certain technical decisions could end up traumatizing based on what the patient said. And clinicians kind of understood the best approaches for engaging with clinicians through digital technologies. So the findings from this study, we are yet to start the analysis. People wrote, as we might have seen from the sticker note, various points, great. And this gives us an indication of which aspect of sexual health would benefit most from trauma-informed design, and what are the best approaches to doing this. And In going forward, once we analyze the data from this summit, it will give us a clear direction of where to focus. And we conducted this stakeholder engagement summit because the literature doesn't exist on trauma-informed design of digital health. Nobody, if anybody at all, they are mostly either software engineers or computer scientists that have done a little bit of work in this area. And from the healthcare perspective, nothing has been done. So we needed to do this stakeholder engagement summit, understand where can we focus this and how would it make an impact? Because identifying the research direction from these conceptualized stages is really important in tackling the problem. Otherwise, if I probably and my team probably decide to just go ahead with what we've taught, maybe in the next 5 years, we may get to realize that we are not even solving the right problems. Now, why is trauma-informed design such an important concern? Why is it important as healthcare professionals? It is important because the use of digital health is quite high. For instance, there was a 60% rate of virtual care use in Canada, and more than 70% of Canadians would access health information on the internet before visiting a healthcare professional. At the same time, we also know that traumatic experiences are quite high. And as I indicated at the beginning, about 63% of Canadians experienced at least one traumatic event during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this percentage would be likely higher among underserved populations. This means that a higher majority of technology users are survivors of trauma or may have experienced a traumatic event or could be associated with somebody who have experienced a trauma. Therefore, designers, healthcare professionals, more particularly digital technology intervention developers, can no longer ignore the ubiquitous trauma in our world and the role they play in people's use of digital technologies. Those designing and using digital health technologies with underserved populations must recognize that people are experiencing harm due to the exclusion caused by poor design decisions, and recognize that a trauma-informed approach can confront and repair some of these harmful design choices. My final food of thought and final point for reflection. And based on the literature I review, I see so many studies that seeks to use digital technologies to help people who have post-traumatic stress disorders. And if you subject this to critical analysis, and from the perspective of trauma-informed care, what is always recommended could rather re-traumatize people rather than helping them. So if we are unable to use digital health technologies to facilitate the healing process for survivors of trauma, we should at least avoid re-traumatizing them through our design choices. It is time we all talk about health equity. And with the increasing use of digital health technologies, these technologies should not be seen as advancing health inequities. They should be a panacea to bridging health inequities that we are confronted with. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, you can let me know.
Thank you, Faru, very much. We do have time for Q&A session, so please put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Faru, if you want to stop sharing, then we can see people, especially if they can raise their hands. We can see people. I think Tanya's applauding as opposed to a hand, or do you have your hand up, Tanya? Any questions? But I was thinking of nursing education when nurse educators, faculty are using digital health or in some way. Have you thought of, to think bring this out to nursing education and the use of digital technologies in the education of students. Have you thought about that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I actually thought about that for sure. And there've been a couple of work about digital technology education among nurses. But in this work, I tend to prioritize the focus area. And this is always often contestable. I spoke with somebody when I was talking about my major focus for this work and the outcome of this work is actually targeted at system developers who are not healthcare professionals. At least every nurse understands a little bit of trauma, understand what could harm people, and nurses are naturally empathetic, and they have the caring attitude and they are educated to do that. So they are not much of an issue. In the context of digital health, the main concern is about technology developers. And this is based on my working relationship with system developers, software engineers, in the sense that they really, really do not, most of the times, they may not probably even understand the topic area. Less to talk about trauma or trauma-informed care, how their design decisions could affect people. I work in digital health, but I don't really do system development. And I work with software engineers, and then maybe I may probably do a lot of stuff, but they do the development. And they really need to understand the impact of their decisions on people's experiences of trauma. In the long term, I would refocus this in education. In fact, we just planning a study that we want to develop a toolkit on how clinicians can appropriately engage with survivors of trauma through virtual communications. And probably what we probably intend to do, some of these toolkits could be used in nursing education, but that's a different area altogether.
Yeah, I know. I thought I mean, yeah.
Any other questions or comments in the chat, or put up your hand or just speak out? Yes, Tanya.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a very relevant presentation and very interesting work that you're doing. I'm an educator in a Red River College Polytech in Winnipeg, and I teach in community health. And so we do a lot with our students in doing health presentations, helping them prepare health presentations for very diverse populations as well. And so the part that really resonated with me when you talked about the eight different populations, and when we talk about at-risk populations, where we want to make sure they're being represented in the educational material.
Yes.
When we're doing the PowerPoint, or if we're presenting to a group of Indigenous youth, we want to make sure that they're being represented in the PowerPoint or in the visual presentation that we're providing as well. And it is hard to find just pictures, graphics, or newcomers to Canada that trying to do make things relevant and appropriate, so they're being represented in what they're seeing as well, and being inclusive. So I think it's a very relevant subject, whether it's completely virtual or we're using audiovisual technology to make it relevant and not traumatizing or re-traumatizing, or even in subtle ways. And I appreciate the fact that you said intentionally or unintentionally, and I think a lot happens unintentionally in healthcare.
Yeah, I think just to add to what you said, this is quite true. And to be honest, nobody really seeks out to cause harm. In fact, people take the extra steps to prevent harm. But when you talk of minority groups, sometimes what you are doing, you are not just sure whether it will is even helpful. I was bring an example, just the same example that you brought. We had we had students, our students who were made to do presentations, and we really, really try to incorporate EDII and making sure that the assignment should adopt an EDI approach and be really inclusive. And one of these students actually made a presentation, very helpful and did really great work, tried to incorporate diverse images. And what happened was that during the presentation, we have indigenous folks in class, and she presented a picture that does not really sit down well with these people, with indigenous, that doesn't represent indigenous people quite well, because the question was like, how could you distinguish between actual representing people and then cultural misappropriation? Then the student was like, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, but these things happened, and this was unintentional. It wasn't that bad anyway. It wasn't a bad incident, but it was like, no, these pictures are in the past. It doesn't represent indigenous people quite well, so don't use it. But this student never knew, but you just go online and probably think like, this is a great picture. And fundamentally, the best approach we advise is co-creation, or what you call co-design. And basically, in the context of digital health technology, what we do is like, as a designer or an engineer, you basically be implementing the decisions that are taken by the group that you intend to serve, the minority groups. But of course, doing work from that perspective is always quite challenging, in that, as you indicated, it's difficult to even get people from this, it's difficult to get adequate representation from these groups. And yeah, it's difficult, but we have to do the difficult work to make sure that healthcare is better for everyone.
I see we have about 3 minutes left before the top of the hour. Does anybody else have a final or question or comment? Seeing and hearing none, thank you again very much for your presentation, Fatou, and thank you to all who registered for the webinar. Please note that a link to the recording of the session will be made available automatically to all of you who have registered, and you please feel free to share that link within your networks. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll hope you consider joining us for our next Lunch and Learn series, which will start in the fall, and please see our website for updates on the next series. Thank you again, Fatou, and everyone have a good rest of the day.
Bye-bye.